Dad always used to say the only causes worth fighting for were the lost causes.
The Senator yield. No, sir, I will not yield.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
You're listening to a Pyrolitical Pyrocast.
Welcome to the Pyrocast, presented by Pyrolitical Radio Show. Hey everyone, I'm Thomas.
And I'm Randall.
We have some great topics for you as usual tonight. Randall, break it down for us.
Break it down. What we're going to talk about tonight, a couple things anyway. We got some changes to tax law that may be beneficial. We're going to talk about those. We're also going to talk about public lands. We never talk about public lands, so we thought we'd take it on today. That among other things. I mean, I should prove for a good show, I think. Thomas, what do you think?
I think they're semi-positive topics, but we'll do our best to cast them in a negative light. And before we get into this, I just want to invite you listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Pyrolitical Live. And then you can get all the notifications and such. You can push that bell, too, in case you really want to be notified every time we upload something, which is at least once a week. Yeah. We do have some exciting things in the works. We're going to increase our reach here and give you more opportunities to enjoy talking politics with us. So, Randall, you talked about tax policy and public lands, and then there's this little story about Amazon that I think is interesting as well. So these are three good topics, two positive, one negative. So let's start with the big one. Trump, he is talking about taxes. And I don't think there's been a president who doesn't talk about taxes, but there hasn't been major shifts to tax policy since 1986 when Mr. Ronald Reagan was in the House, the White House to be exact.
But not the House of Representatives. Don't get that wrong.
No, he just played one in movies, so maybe. I think Reagan did a movie about that. But anyway, Trump sent out his tax guys to reveal this one-page, 200-word memo, essentially, to fix the tax code. What did you think about this overall?
Well, I think it has some major potential benefits for the nation, because it should be primarily a simplification of tax code, and then secondarily a reduction in a lot of different tax burdens. One of the big ones that the media is talking about is the change in the overall percentage rate for corporations, specifically corporations that pass on earnings to the owners. Say like an S Corp or an LLC, the earnings aren't taxed in the entity, they're taxed when they come down as business earnings to the owner. And so that rate will drop as low as 15%, which... And
Republicans have an issue with that. They only wanted to go, like Paul Ryan only wanted to go to 20. So I highly doubt they would pass something like that. But I love the gusto of 15%. It's wonderful.
Now, obviously, opponents are saying, well, wait a second, that's going to decrease revenues significantly, because here you are, they're saying there's a potential loophole, because now you may have people that migrate from being wage earners and receiving a salary to being a business owner and receiving that business income rather than a salary, right? Because the salary may still be taxed as high as 35%, depending on how much it is.
Which is not a bad thing. I didn't think about that. The more business owners we have, the better. If it encourages entrepreneurialism, that's truly an American philosophy. So that's good. But that would have a drastic impact, not just from the rate reduction, but also from the kind of a social standpoint. Good point, Randall.
Yeah, and as well, they're talking about they want to also roughly double the standard deduction that individual or married couples filing jointly can receive, from about $12,600 to $24,000 that they'd be able to deduct. With the emphasis being that they're that if they can get people to, instead of taking an itemized deduction, which takes a lot more time and effort, not only to file taxes, but also to audit the taxes. Then they can take a standardized deduction, and maybe that's as much or more. It's an easier route. Hopefully it leads to less overhead from the IRS and from the CPA filing the taxes, and as a result, saving taxpayers and the federal government millions and millions of dollars per year. But again, opponents are saying, will that end up costing us more because we're giving away twice as much back to, we're giving them back twice
their
as
money.
much?
Well, I think that those opponents of it have a valid point on the one side of the coin. They are right, because we're not talking any spending reduction, which politicians on all levels want to do. They want to express that, hey, if we lower taxes, we'll get more revenue, but we're not going to cut the spending. And so they're right on that side. However, some of the things they say are quite, self-interested. Like the realtors are against this because the plan would eliminate some deductions for buying homes. So the realtors are all up in arms. Yet the Chamber of Commerce are like, yeah, this would grow jobs, it would do all this. But when Trump and ilk say we want to create prosperity, I would rather they say we want to cut this amount of spending, and in combination with that, we want to cut the amount in taxes, because then that would be even. It would be deficit neutral. The problem with that is you're not actually solving the problem of the continuing debts and deficits, because you'll continue to raise the debt ceiling. So you've got this on the one hand trying to increase the productivity and the prosperity of the country, but at the same time you're not fixing the fundamental problem. And so it's always a weird thing when politicians propose tax cuts, although we're not opposed to them. People don't want to give up programs. And that's where the Democrats are really howling about this.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because you'll have many people who would say his budget proposal already talked about cutting, funding for all these different programs, right? We want to cut,
right.
But he increased defense by $65 billion,
right around there.
And as a result, he's like, are we really cutting that much spending? I mean, ultimately, I think we're not really, it didn't really reduce spending. It probably maybe even increased it some, because the amount that's coming from a lot of those superfluous programs that, justly so, could probably use a trimming. And we've talked about that on previous shows, or a trimming or a removal, extraction.
The chopping off of the head, yes.
That we're not really reducing overall spending, because now we're putting even more money into the federal government's military aspirations.
Right. Well, what you're doing is you're saying, I'm going to keep the credit card going, but I'm going to stop spending money over here. I'm going to stop eating out, but I'm going to keep spending the same amount on the credit card. Now, it's a little more complex than that, but that's the gist. Like you said, they were going to take the 7 tax brackets, which 39.6 is the highest, and they want to reduce that down to the 3, where it'd be 15, 25, and 30. I do think overall it would be very positive, because the more you simplify things in life in general, the better it is. And so I think that's good. They're going to retain 3 deductions: charitable giving, the mortgage tax credit, or whatever it is, mortgage insurance, and then there was retirement. They're not going to have you deduct that anymore as well. So the funny thing, Randall, is I found that Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon, he's the top Democrat on the Senate Finance Committee. He says, this is an unprincipled tax plan that will result in cuts for the wealthiest Americans, conflicts for the president, crippling debt for America, and crumbs for the working people. And clearly that is the tired mantra that is always put out in this situation. It's hardly crumbs when you go from $12,000 to $24,000 deductible income. That's not crumbs. Standardizing everything and decreasing, and then encouraging people to own businesses, that's not crumbs either. So
no.
And we must remember Wyden was teamed up with our ex-Senator Bennett to create the Wyden-Bennett bill, which became Romneycare, which became Obamacare. So this Wyden character needs to go. He's been around forever, causing issues. So for him to criticize it, go away.
Well, that just that just maybe says, okay, well, spend some more time looking at this. Maybe it's worthwhile. They're also, as part of this plan, they're proposing, they haven't released details on this, but a supposed one-time tax holiday for to try and incentivize companies to bring trillions of dollars currently held in countries outside the United States back in.
Yeah.
And so they didn't
tax holiday.
Yeah, we'll lower the bar, bring them back in, and so that might be a potential boon.
But do you think that that's because they know it's a temporary thing? Do you think that those investors and corporate people would be like, I'm not going to transfer all my money in? I guess it depends on how long the holiday is, but it just seems like just keep it permanent. Well, they can't unless they got the 60 votes in the Senate. So they're going to do reconciliation, which just means in the Senate they can have a simple majority, and it can't be permanent. It can only last for 10 years. So the Republicans have been vocal to say we'll do reconciliation to get this. So 10 years. But I don't know how long this tax holiday would last. Would you, Randall, if you were a wealthy investor, would you hurry and get your money back into the U.S. and try to take advantage of that while it's going on, and then hurry and take your money out of the country once it's ending? Well, I mean, look at the potential. I mean, obviously, there are going to be those that are going to say, "Nah, I'm fine having my money overseas. I've dealt with it this long. I'm not going to bring it back just to lose it." When they increase tax rates or capital gains or whatever. But it does present an interesting opportunity for an individual who maybe they have a business they'd like to expand, and they've got a good nest egg overseas, Cayman Islands, Swiss bank, whatever. And so here they have an opportunity to bring that cash back in at a lower rate and reinvest it in their company. Maybe.
And
what would the rate be? They didn't reveal the rate.
They haven't revealed that. So who knows?
It'd have to be pretty low. It'd have to be 5-10% maybe.
But the logic, I mean, thinking down this, the closest thing I can see to this is kind of the logic that's been going on in the marijuana crowd, which is, okay, do you want to have people are going to smoke marijuana, right? People are going to send money overseas, those that can. Do we want to just continue to spend money to try and stop them, or should we turn that into a revenue center and be able to tax that because it's a legal activity that we tax? So we lower the tax and we get 10% or 15% of millions or billions even versus 50% of nothing, right? Or 80% of nothing. I don't know what the rate is for that, but it's like, okay, so it could make some sense. You may get some people bringing money back. I'm sure you're going to have people who aren't going to bring any in at all. But I mean, I think it's a legitimate proposal. It's worth talking about and saying, hey, you know what? Maybe there's a potential here for some positive. Yeah,
it like I said, the negative, it doesn't really address the debt or the deficit. No. And it's like, hey, we'll just pump you up with steroids based on natural chemicals instead of synthetic, meaning spending and building and doing all these things. But there is some interesting aspects around it I want to ask you about. There's a lot of tax deductions which are being jettisoned. And as I said, they're only keeping 3, which were the retirement savings, charitable giving, and mortgage interest. But the tax deduction that people can currently claim on state and local taxes that they pay every calendar year, there's a provision that it saves basically $1 trillion over 10 years in local and state taxes. Now, basically, they would do away with this, and this can be extremely high in places like California and New York. Nunchin, who's one of the economic council people, anyway, he says it's not the federal government's job to be subsidizing the states. That's an interesting phrase. Yes, he's right, but technically the feds are sucking us dry. So they've been throwing that back to citizens. So what do you think about that aspect of it, Randall?
No, I thought that was really interesting, especially the verbiage that he used, because, I mean, obviously we're in a state of Utah, which is currently controlled, 65% of it controlled by the federal government. So that's non-taxable land. And so typically the way that the federal government placates states like Utah is they send them back a significant amount of money so that they don't push back too hard. They don't try and tax those lands.
Well, and they also pay the law enforcement in the county to patrol those lands and for other security type things. At least that's what my county commission told me when I met with the auditor. So they get quite a bit of money based on certain formulas and expenditures throughout the year. So law enforcement, your sheriffs aren't that motivated in the West because they get a lot of money from the feds to police those lands. And obviously some of that's justified. However, what a mess that is. We should just be in charge of the land. But that's going to come up in our next topic.
Yes, indeed.
Anyway.
But keeping on this topic and talking about it, I think it's interesting because the first thought I had as I read that was this might be a great opportunity, because if the federal government, the Trump administration specifically, takes this direction, it may lead to some pushback from the states, because if it went even to the point, I mean, obviously, I think you and I would be on the same page about income tax, saying, we shouldn't have it, for one.
Yeah.
But if we went back even to a position where we still have income tax, but the state is responsible to collect it and send it on to the federal government, then the federal government doesn't have to subsidize because the state keeps the funds that they need and they send everything else on to the federal government.
There you go.
Then the state isn't seen as being subsidized, but the state is also in control of sending money to the federal government, which is what it was supposed to be like initially. I mean, that was the whole idea. We go to war and the president would go around to all the states and talk to them and say, hey, we've got this collective effort. We're fighting this war. We need more funds. So this is what we need based on your population, however many millions or billions of dollars. And the state would figure out how to come up with it. Or the state could say, no, we don't agree with your crazy war. We're not going to fund it. And it allowed the states to have a say back in Washington, D.C. This, maybe it's a really long shot, and it is. But I just think maybe it'll open up that dialogue, and maybe we'll get back to some principles, baby. I don't know. Maybe.
No. Just kidding. I don't know. I mean, Trump's unpredictable, and even if it's flawed like this, I do pray and hope for Trump to have a good victory on something that's substantial, whether it's healthcare and it does actually make a difference, or this tax plan. I would like to see him do something that's even 60% good, especially with our everyday lives and spending. And I think with the feds, it's interesting because it used to be that way where they'd have the states. Well, let's just say this. The states had a baby. It was the federal government. And they said, hey, baby, you can do these few things, but we do everything else, or the people in our state have the rights for anything else that we didn't specifically say you could do. Well, now that's been flipped. And I noticed I was at an event the other day, and this is kind of off topic, but they had people doing the pledge, and they had a flag, the U.S. flag, and they had the state flag. And they came forward and they presented those. It was at the county convention last week. And so what the armed guards or whatever they do with the flag, they put the flag forward and they put the state flag way lower in front of them and kept the U.S. flag up high. And I thought, that's a metaphor. That is a metaphor for how the states deal with the federal government. Now, Randall, what you said is so critical, is that the state has to collect the tax revenues that go out to the feds. For years, people were saying, we want to keep more of our money, get more back from the feds. And it's like, no, we want to keep our money in state in the first place. So right. I think that you've hit on a very important topic, and I think it ties into our philosophies and everything else. So even how we hold flags at county conventions.
The primary means of control in our day and age is not by force. Like guns force. Although that happens, the primary means is by funding. And so all these arms of government, they're just tools to distribute money to win favors or control individuals. And so changing the way that funds are allocated so that somebody else in the middle, a middleman, so to speak, being the state who's supposed to be protecting our interests against the federal government's overreach and tyranny. That's exactly what they're supposed to do. And right now they're not given that. They're not given that option. And so if we want to see a real return to principle, I think that's a great start. I mean, I love Ron Paul, and Ron Paul talks all the time. I mean, his big item is end the Fed, audit the Fed, get the people, if they saw what was going to happen or what was happening with the Fed, where the Fed was allocating money, giving money, how it was creating money, that it would cause an uproar in the people, and the people would call for change. And I think that this is almost on the other side, where you say, okay, we realize that the federal government is going to spend so much money regardless of the amount of money they bring in. They're just going to spend it. No matter who we send back to Washington, D.C., there's always plenty of people back there to say, I don't care what you're saying, we're going to spend more and more and more. And so the Federal Reserve is going to keep printing that money. But if we can allow the people to keep more of that money through a tax change like this, even if the deficits and debts grow, then maybe the people can be more prepared, one. And if we're able to have the states have an interest in there, because somehow we're able to get that process changed so the states are controlling the money, then they can put some reins on or prepare more fully to be able to help take care of their constituents when the crap hits the fan, which it will. I mean, we've succeeded in major miracle once the dollar was decoupled, and we've kept the dollar, the oil dollar, going for decades. But it could come tumbling down at any time, and when it does, there goes the Fed.
I think, and I think I think Americans miss something when they think about economic matters with the government. You should assume that the outcome by the feds, whether it's the debts, the deficits, the military spending, the tax code, you should assume that this was all done on purpose. I think we have too much stock in the belief that government's inept or that they are incapable. Like my dad once told me Obama couldn't run a lemonade stand, and it's like, no, but he could definitely tax 1,000 of them to death. Like they're not dumb. Like when I spent the 8 days up at the state legislature, they got a ton of things done. They passed almost half the bills that came through the legislature on a record-setting year for number of bills. So they're very, very capable of running us into the ground, and they do it on purpose. Now, you mentioned earlier, Randall, repatriation, and that's when companies put their money and resources offshore, and then they bring that money back in and pay it out in dividends to shareholders instead of using it for hiring and investing. Now, when Trump was on the campaign trail, he was proposing a levy or a tariff. He was going to levy a tax or do a tariff against companies that move overseas and then try to sell their products back to U.S. consumers. Now, thankfully, that plan that rolled out this week didn't have anything like that. I just feel like tariffs, that protectionism, I understand the motivation, but it always backfires. It's just a violation of the free market. And so I'm glad to see that this new plan doesn't have anything with tariffs and levying taxes on businesses that try to sell here that produce overseas. What it does is it lowers the freaking tax rate. So they say, hey, I make more money if I produce here and spend here. It's common sense, even if Democrats are like, wait, it's a tax cut for the rich. Well, yeah. It is.
Yeah.
Oh, did I say trickle down economics? I think that's what fueled the 90s, because think about it. Tax policy can have immediate impacts, but it also has long terms, and we're in a 7 to 10 year cyclical thing. I looked at history economically, and it's always about a 7 to 10 year turnaround on policies. And so I think Reagan's tax policies helped the boom of the 90s. And so I think we would see great benefit in the 2020s. Sounds weird to say that.
It's coming. But so the lack of any mention of tariffs, increasing. I mean, obviously he's still trying to build a wall, so we'll build walls all over the place, both economic and physical. So the lack of saying that whether they're going to do something there or not, doesn't mean it won't happen, but that may be part of their long-term goal, saying, okay, we're going to provide an avenue for repatriation for people to bring money back in, and we'll give them some additional incentive, because if we increase tariffs and, try and become more mercantilist instead of free market, then they'll want to bring their business back here, because it'll be too expensive to try and get into the U.S. market to sell things. And so they may want to bring that money back, as well as jobs or whatever else is what the assumption's going to be.
Yeah, and you know how you almost guarantee there's two things that this prosperity play will work. Number one, have the money that comes back in under this policy tax-free, to bring it all in, no penalties, no levies, nothing. And then number two, give the market a dependable long-term schedule for this, even if it was 10 years. Because if I know that I bring my money back, no tax issues, and I've got at least 5 to 10 years where I know what the tax rates will be, I think that's when you can guarantee that prosperity would flourish, because nothing works better in a market than predictability. It's what works in personal lives. It's household economics and national rental. It's like, if I'm going to start a business, I can't have questions about what will the tax rates be and how many people will I have to not hire full-time to get insurance or benefits. All that stuff creates costs, and it creates uncertainty, and there's nothing in life worse for your economic prosperity than uncertainty. And I am certain of that.
No, definitely. And the volatility.
Just keep it steady. Keep the ship steady.
That's right. And that's the thing. Even just writing a law that says that, this is what the level's going to be, even if it was higher than what's being said here, or even increased, but saying, and it will not be able to be changed for 10 years or 20 years or whatever, say it's set in stone for this long. Providing that certainty will make all the difference for a marketplace, because all of a sudden, I talk about it all the time. All these people talk about how World War II ended the Great Depression, and it did, but not because of why people think. They think, you had everybody in jobs, and all of a sudden the economy recovered. I think that was just an offshoot from it. The difference was that the government stopped meddling in the economy, because their focus was on Germany and Japan, and preparing to go and fight these people overseas. So yes, there was a lot of economic throughput that happened because we were building all these tanks and planes and whatever for the war effort. But at the same time, there were a lot of other jobs that were shifted around and moved around because of the war effort. So jobs were destroyed at the same time that would have been there otherwise. But it was the shift in focus. So there was so much going on during the Great Depression where the government was saying, "Oh, well, we're going to have our 5-year plan or whatever. We're going to get people out. We're going to spend money. We'll get people to work. We'll do all these things." And in the end, I don't think that any of those things were effective. Yeah, they maybe made a little difference. Somebody worked for the CCC and they had a little bit of money to give to their family, but it only continued the tragedy, which was the Great Depression. And so now we look to the beacon of destruction, being World War II, as the herald of prosperity in the United States, when it was just merely, in my mind, the changing of focus of the federal government, so they stopped meddling, that allowed for the prosperity to happen. And so, there's that certainty, that constant. There was a Great Depression, if you will, that happened in the 1920s, but we don't hear about it because the government did nothing. They said, no, we can't do anything, right? So it was after World War I and early 1920s, the dollar dipped. There was a panic, people died, and lives were lost and jobs were lost, but the economy recovered and was even doing better, 2 or 3 years after it occurred, even though the dip was almost as significant.
Well, I think it's important too to point out here that governments can do only three things in an economy. They can either kill it, flat out socialize, communize everything and take your property and, your life, or they can do this uncertainty play where they'll stimulate this part of the economy and then it has a domino effect on all these other parts. They'll give people who are connected and lobbyists, they'll give those industries certain breaks. There's the mega rich, they get certain breaks. But then everybody below getting these watered down dollars through the Fed system, it's a mess. And that's kind of where we are most of the time with exception for the big bubbles. Or then the third option is government just get out of the way, standardize it, and let people produce according to their abilities. And that's what I see this plan generally taking us towards as a third option, which I'm very happy about. I did want to throw something in.
Well,
go ahead.
Share that, and then I got a story to share.
Well, I just want to say, as part of this plan, individuals with estates of 5.5 million or couples with estates worth 11 million, they get to pass on their resources, their capital, to their heirs tax-free. So they're trying to kill the death tax, the estate tax. That is a wonderful thing. I don't care how rich or poor you are. That is awesome. So, Randall, go ahead.
Well, I was just trying to find the exact name here of the story. Anyway, it's about a guy named McCormick, Cyrus McCormick. He invented the Reaper.
That's a great name.
Yeah. Anyway, he invented the Reaper in the early 1800s. And so what we had at that time was people were still raising grain, in small family farms. They were cutting it with the scythe, just by hand. And that's how you had to do it. And at the time, an individual could only do about a half acre a day, and your wheat harvest was about 10 days long. So you could do, if you had one person, you could do about 5 acres, and that was it. So if you had a family, the whole family was engaged, because if you let the wheat stand too long and waited for the harvest, it would go bad, and you couldn't harvest it, and it was just, you were done, right? And so family farms that operated this way could get enough wheat for themselves, maybe just a little bit more, not a ton more. And so Cyrus McCormick came along, and he saw this, and he invented the Reaper, which basically allowed you to go and cut down. At the end, the last version of the machine would cut the wheat, it would pile it up, and then put it into a sheave, and then it would get 5 of them together, it'd hand, or not by hand, but the machine would tie up the sheaves and then put 5 of them together in a pile, and then somebody could come through and get it. And he could do, with the first version, they were able to do like 6 acres in an afternoon. And so really it ushered in this age of all of a sudden he solved the hunger problem. Right? There was no longer a significant chance that famine would wipe out a significant number of people. That first started in the U.S., and he brought his invention over to England. Anyway, there's great story. I think it's freely available online in a lot of different places. Anyway, so Cyrus McCormick, his story. But the amazing thing is one of the big reasons why he was able to do what he did is he was in early America, right? Early 1800s, he lived in a time of great, enormous economic freedom like we've never seen before. You could come in, which was a new thing, you could come in and own your land, and all these immigrants were coming to the U.S. and owning land, and the taxes were almost non-existent. So you could... Yeah. And then
that corresponds with the small government that was at the time.
Exactly. And so here we went, the people were farming basically the same way as the Egyptians were thousands of years before. There'd been no major change in the way we harvested. There'd been a few different changes in the way we plow or whatnot, but most of the implements were the same. And that economic situation allowed for the creation of this. He found when he went to Europe that it wasn't well received at first, because most of the people worked on a farm that they were like just paid laborers, and they worked for nothing for the lords, the nobles. And so the nobles were like, well, why do I want to get this? I've got all these people, they cost me next to nothing, or they were serfs and they didn't have to pay them anything to do it anyway. Right? So it took them a little while to get people to buy them in Europe, but finally they did, and it changed everything. And so that's what happens when you have a lower tax burden and you have a lower burden, less invasive government, where you have people that are able to just take their ideas, they see a problem, they fix a problem. It doesn't just end up being little things like we get now, a little innovation on top of a little innovation on top of a little innovation, but a major breakthrough in capacity. And that's what happens. That's the beauty. And like you were saying, sorry, I keep going on here, but like you were saying, that's probably why we had all this innovation in the 90s, because of trickle-down economics. We lowered the tax burden, and all of a sudden, all this investment went into technology. It'd been there since the 70s, right? And and innovation was happening, but it changed in a drastic way in the 90s. We had the dot-com boom that came on. I mean, we had all this extra money in the economy, for better or for worse. I mean, we can go on and on. We got other reasons for what happened in the dot-com bubble, but anyway.
Sure. So
Cyrus McCormick, go look him up. Awesome story.
Well, I think, that was awesome. Whenever I see a scythe or a picture of a scythe nowadays, I'll think about that. It's kind of tough because prosperity has brought some interesting challenges to our lives, and this is in fact, I think we've pretty much covered Trump tax plan. Overall, it's a good thing. I'd like to see it at least get substantially into place. But I just remember as a small business owner one time, I had a small business for a couple of years, and one day the IRS showed up and they just said we owed them more taxes. We didn't realize we did. So we're like, okay, what do we owe you? And it was a substantial amount just because we were new to this thing. And so for Medicare and Social Security, it was just amazing that it felt like a shakedown. I know people have paid taxes their whole life, but unless something is done substantially, we are on our merry way to full out socialism and annihilation as a nation. It's just, we can't continue down this road, especially harming small businesses, because small businesses, are overwhelming majority of all companies in this nation, and that is what you've got to encourage. Most aren't rich and don't have the connections to government, so we've got to push for the common man and woman to get the tax breaks, and I think Trump's doing that overwhelmingly. Even if the Washington Post says this is about helping the rich, that's fine. Help the rich because they help the poor. Well, Randall.
I one more point.
One more?
Yeah, even though they say it's helping the rich. I mean, how many people? I mean, you had Bloomberg and lots of other billionaires who came out completely against Trump. So why would then we assume that he's doing this specifically to help the rich? I mean, other than maybe himself, which I'm sure he'd love to see it himself. I mean, who doesn't want to keep the fruit of their labor? I just think it's silly that it's like, oh, he's working with all his cronies. Well, I mean, the Democrats pulled out tons of people who were like, he's an awful guy. I hate him. I'm a more billionaire than he's a billionaire, and blah, 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 blah. It's just, it was funny.
That's true. And you can criticize Trump a ton on conflicts of interest, the fact that he didn't put his stuff in a blind trust. He's still making money. The very appearance of ill doing is just so obvious with him. And so there's plenty to criticize Trump on. However, if you see in a plan that you're going to pay no estate tax when you die, if you're going to see that, or at least those who die in the next 10 years, or if you see that your tax rates are going to go down substantially, you can't criticize a president for that, no matter how bad you think he is. So if you're criticizing that stuff, well, I'll take your tax money. I just want to help you live by your principles. So give me your money, and that will be good. All right. So, Randall, we've talked Trump tax plan for 40 minutes, which is great. Let's talk some more Trump. In fact, let's switch from money to land. I saw a video today where Trump was talking about the Antiquities Act, and he was talking about an executive order. And our illustrious senator was there, Orrin Hatch from Utah. You know, he's going on 43, 44 years as a senator. That's wonderful for him. Anyway, but he was there, and Trump is re-looking at national monuments. And I don't know if you know the history of the Antiquities Act. It was passed in 1906. National monuments are different than national parks. National parks take an act of Congress. National monuments can just be designated by the president, and the whole point of it was to protect special and precious artifacts or sites. First national monument was a devil's something. It was this like rock peak, and it was about 2 acres square. And now we've got presidents designating 1.6, 1.3 miles square or acres square of land in Utah. And I get everything from 64 to 70-something% that is Fed controlled. Huge amount of it is BLM land and national monuments. So anyway, Randall, I'm not that hopeful, but I'm somewhat hopeful because Trump's speech was fine. The problem is the Secretary of the Interior, his rhetoric following it was not very reassuring.
Well, you know, rhetoric is just that. It's rhetoric. The very fact that he's addressing it and saying we're going to look back to 96, they say, hey, I remember what happened in 96, and that was the Escalante Grand Staircase National Monument here in Utah. Major land grab. It was just before the Apex coal mine was set to really kick into operation with this supposedly the world's largest coal reserve right here in southern Utah. And it was going to bring lots of jobs and cheap coal. And then overnight, all of a sudden, Bill Clinton with Al Gore went to the rim of the Grand Canyon and signed an executive order. We're going to make this all a national monument. And and obviously the representatives at that point in time were like, hey, we got to try and fix this or whatnot. And
gosh darn it, we're really mad.
Yeah, well, part of it was, obviously their main focus or the main legitimate focus that they felt like they could get was that Utah has all these plots of land that are set up as school trust land, right?
Yes.
And the whole idea with those lands are that they're held in trust with the state until such time as the state sells them to generate funds for education. That's their whole reason for existence. And so here were these millions of acres of land that were taken. And so they're like, okay, well, this is our main hot button is we need funds for education. That's what Utahns are always worried about. And so that was the main thrust. We need, you've got all these 40-acre parcels that are in there that were for funding education, and now you've taken them. So then they had a land exchange in order to give more land for that, and they grew it even larger, the national monument, as a result of that land exchange. And so just crazy. So that's the only thing they were able to do was a little bit of a land exchange to get some funds for education. But the fact that they're willing to look at that, go back and say, okay, because I remember at the time it was crazy. People were up in arms. They were pretty put out that President Clinton had signed that.
Especially people in that area.
Yeah. Here in southern Utah, they're like jobs depending on it and whatnot. And they're like, no, it's done. You don't have access to it.
This is one time I actually believe Senator Bennett. He said we had heard some rumblings, and about 3 days later, President Clinton was there with the media. And so it is not surprising that coal mine was annihilated basically by that order. And just so people know, this executive order will have these national monuments re-examined.
Right.
And things like there's Hawaii's Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument.
Don't try and pronounce it.
Pokabukandika. Kalikilikimaka. That's all I know. But anyway, Bush, he designated that in 2006, and then Obama quadrupled it in size a decade later. The things that could be the monuments that could be affected by Trump's order, you're looking at 2 to 3 dozen here. You've got 5 in California, you've got 1 to 3 in Utah, 4 to 5 in Arizona, and so on and so forth. So this is not a law. This is not a huge deal as far as anything happening. But it is a huge deal for a president to say, let's give the lands back to the people.
Right.
That is really amazing to hear from a president. We haven't heard that. We didn't hear from Bush or anybody else. So I was really happy to see that. And there's a nice list at the Washington Post or the WashingtonCompost.com. You can go find the story that's Trump orders review of national monuments. So anyway, we've had this big battle in Utah over Bears Ears, which is a 1.35 million acre national monument Obama declared in December. Now, the thing, Randall, and the thing that ticks me off so much about this story in the Washington Compost, Randall, is that they said that all of these tribes, environmentalist groups, and Utahns are supporting it. However, every GOP legislator is against the monument. And I thought, you liars. There are so many Utahns in polls that are against this, the majority. There are Indian tribes which are against this. There are legislators, all of them in that county that are against this, and the Utah State Legislature as well. So to put it into, hey, all of these people are for it, then the GOP or the politicians are against it. That is such garbage.
When you've got an agenda, you gotta push the agenda. Now, I mean, there were lots of people who were worried. They're like, here we are. We're right on the edge of Bears Ears as it sits right now. A lot of it was already in a national forest, right? Most of it was federally controlled anyway, so there was a level of protection there. But, a lot of these people, tribe members, they like to go and gather wood. They like to go and hunt. They like to go and do different things up in the wilderness, drive their vehicles up there. And this basically changing it to a national monument from a national forest and BLM land really restricted what they could do in their backyard. And so you may have some tribe members that are like, oh, we're going to preserve this land. It's a good thing. But then you had others that were against it. And so it's like, to say one tribe was, oh yeah, we're all for it. That wasn't the case. Just like any issue, it's like no one's out there just like unanimously, everyone's for this, except for those crusty white guys in Washington.
Or in Salt Lake City. And here's the thing, Randall,
and Governor Herbert.
Angered me. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, and they said implicated Governor Herbert. And I'll give Governor Herbert kudos for actually saying anything about it.
I got to think. Because what?
Well, because typically he's just so milquetoast on almost any issue that it's like he doesn't want to ruffle any feathers. He doesn't want to get people upset. He always is very political about everything. So
I think he's just doing that to fool you, Randall.
Okay, totally fooled.
But I wanted to say this. This really angered me about this because I'll bet you even have people from the same tribes. Let's give Native Americans the benefit of the doubt that they have their own way of thinking. They have their culture and their tribes, so it's different. But I can't imagine every Ute was for this. In fact, there were lots of Native Americans from different tribes that came to lots of protests. But listen to this guy. Now, his name's Sean Chapoose, I think it is. He's the highest elected office holder of the Ute Indian tribe. He said in a statement, as tribes, notice he's speaking for other tribes, which is probably a no-no, we will gather ourselves together to continue to fight to save our lands for the future of not just Native people, but all people who connect with these lands. Bears Ears National Monument is more than just mere federal land to us, as it may be to many other stakeholders. Yeah, stakeholders, people who want to make money. It is a living landscape. It has a pulse. It is offensive for politicians to call the Bears Ears National Monument an abuse because Trump, end quote, Trump called it a federal land grab. I think that is such a bunch of crap, and here's why. As a Native American, the federal government has done nothing but butcher and destroy your tribes forever. You have had 500 treaties broken by the federal government with Indian tribes, and yet you want to say that working with the feds is your way to protect those lands? if I was Native American, and it's firing me up as just some white guy, if I was a Native American, I would come up to that guy and tell him what I thought, because 500 treaties have been broken with Native Americans, over 500, and yet you want to say the feds are your key to protecting the land? What a hypocritical thing to say. I just think that is such blatant bullcrap. And honestly, a lot of tribes get money from the feds and land.
All of them.
What do they do with it? Build casinos and different things. It's like we want to protect these Native Americans who actually use the land, and regular white folks in all races who use these lands. Just gets me fired up when I hear someone who should know better, given history.
Yeah.
As a white man, I understand the plight of Native Americans, sure. I'm just saying, you deserve better than this, and whatever Mr. Chapoose is saying, that is just not right, in my view. So, anyway.
Yeah. Well, it's encouraging to see that, because obviously Barack Obama did a bunch of these different designations right as he was leaving.
I think he did 5 million acres total over his presidency.
And a lot of it, 1.35 is just this one. Right?
Go ahead. I'm just looking up how many. I want to make sure.
Okay, looking up how many. Anyway, so it's like,
I'm not ignoring you.
So it's good because here we have, we had a lame duck president. They may have had some idea they wanted to do whatever, leave a legacy, and trounce all over people's rights. And so they're going to make all these national monuments when, maybe the Antiquities Act has been used for some amazing things, maybe. But it's really to have the president have arbitrary ability to go through and just say, I'm going to make this land special. It's like waving a fairy wand. He doesn't have a fairy wand. It's a gun, right? He can go in and he could say, no, sorry, you may own part of that land, but I just took it over. You may have a lease to that land. I just took it over. You can't use it anymore. You may, and so the opponents of this say, well, how else are we going to preserve land? Because Congress can't agree on anything. The Antiquities Act gives them the right. You know what? You could designate everything as antiquities. If I had a Model T Ford, I could probably go out and say it's an antiquity, because it's so stinking old now. But I don't want the federal government waving their wand over the top of it. I still want to use it the way I want to use it because I live here. Just because the Sierra Club or whatever, club wants to say we want to protect Utah, I want to protect Utah too. But I want Utah to protect Utah. I want the citizens to protect Utah. I don't want the federal government telling Utah how it will and won't use the land. They're in Washington, D.C. They don't even know what red dirt looks like. They have trees and grass. They don't live in a desert. They don't know how to live in a desert. Their policies are not meant for this area. That's one of the reasons why we have a state and a local government, to help understand the people that live in this area. And so for these groups and agencies to say we've got to preserve these areas in a special way with the federal government that's a far off capital that doesn't understand the people and wants to make these changes, I think it's bogus. I think it's totally bogus, and the Antiquities Act is being used out of context. Like you said, it was initially for like a 2-acre parcel because we wanted to preserve something that's of unique purpose. And you know what? A mountain may be of unique purpose, and it may look great, but you don't have to designate it as a national monument in order to preserve it. The people can respect it on their own. Okay, I'll give you a second to chat.
Well, I wanted to just show you how egregious this is. Now, I'm going to do math on the air. As an artist, this is a dangerous thing. But as of December 30th, Barack Obama had created 29 federal national monument designations. I was wrong.
29.
5 million? Try 550 million acres.
Wow.
That he put under protection under the Antiquities Act. Now think about that. 550 million is more than $500 million. You know how many acres are in the continental 48 states? 1.9 billion acres. So 550 is roughly 28%-ish unless I'm missing something. It's in that range.
What were the numbers again?
550 million out of 1.9 billion acres.
Yeah.
See if I'm right there.
You're pretty
good.
So
our president put under protection 28% of the nation. That's one freaking president. Now, he didn't just designate all new. It's not just new monuments, because he did one that was like 325 acres. I mean, there's small up till the 1.7 billion and all that, or million.
You were right on, man. 28.9%, so almost 29.
Now, if that's not tyranny, if that is not a king and we are in a serfdom, we live in different vassals, it's just, it is such a violation of the spirit and letter of the law when it comes to the Constitution. I guess until I knew these numbers, I thought he had put 5 million. It's 550 million. To me, that is grotesque. And I got those numbers from the Business Insider, which is showing pictures of all of these monuments. But it's disgusting. It is disgusting as a republic where the feds were created by the states. And yet here we are with King Obama and King Bush and all the kings before them just scooping up these lands since Theodore Roosevelt. Makes me sick, man. I'm going to go off camera to throw up in a garbage can, because I just feel like, how far have we come? And then Trump wants to cut our tax rates by 10, 15%, and they're freaking out.
Right.
All of that wasted production locked up by the feds. So anyway, just angers me.
Yeah, well, rightly so. Rightly so. I mean, it really strikes. People back in Washington, D.C. don't really see this. And people back east don't see this. They just say, oh, we need to protect that land. But for people out west, it's their backyards. You know, it's like people in the east, they go and they use the waterways and they use whatever. And there's all this private land, you know, and there's very little federal land. But you get out here and it's like, you know, the feds locked up this land so we couldn't have access to it already, right? So it's theirs. We can't buy it, but now you're trying to make it so we can't even access the land, and or unless we do it under specific parameters. I just think it's really sad, and I'm glad. I mean, we've talked about this several times, Thomas. So I'm sure those who have listened to us for a while aren't surprised at our opinion here. But I think it's wonderful that there is an executive, whether you agree with him or not, that he's at least taking the time to look at this issue and talking about it, because this hasn't happened, like you were saying. And so I hope that we'll see some positive change come out of this. I hope that we'll see maybe a reversal or a reduction or whatever. I mean, and maybe it'll open up the dialogue enough that we can have that discussion about federal versus state land control. And maybe we can even see that reverse.
This is really an important thing too, and keep track of these outdoorsman organizations, like the one in Montana called the Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. Their website's backcountryhunters.org, and they look like this wonderful outdoor organization. They love the hunting and all this stuff. It's not true. In fact, John Gale, who's the conservation director, says, quote, neither sportsmen nor other public land users would stand in the way of an objective attempt to ensure the integrity of recent monument designations. Yet this administration's announcement, which seems to be spurred by anti-public lands, members of Congress in Utah, could create unintended consequences that jeopardize important fish and wildlife habitat on public lands, end quote. Hey, knucklehead. Let the states manage their own resources. If you're so much for Montana-based backcountry hunting and angling, then you guys take care of your own. Don't use the federal government. For hunters and outdoors organizations and for Native American tribes to be siding with the federal government,
radio show is off the air. Will suffer no longer.
It's a violation of our
follow us on
rights.
Twitter or friend us on YouTube.
Totally. And
you can do all of this and more at Pyrolitical.com.
It's time to go off the air, Thomas.
Pyrolitical.
I feel like I'm at the Oscars.
You
feel like you're at the Oscars?
See you in cyberspace.
I'm not done speaking. Don't play the music. For outdoors enthusiasts and Native American tribes to side with the federal government in the management of lands, you are an enemy to the rights of the people.
That's right.
There, that was what I wanted to say.
And you said it, and you said it well. So thank you for listening in tonight. This has been a Pyrolitical Pyrocast. We're glad you joined us. Please subscribe on YouTube, like us on Facebook. We appreciate having you here. These are important topics to talk about. So until next time, be awesome.